Welcome to Stories of Slavery. In today's episode, we travel back to 1859 and follow Seraphina Drake, an enslaved black girl whose beauty turned into a curse. The mistress couldn't stand the attention Seraphina received, and her response went far beyond cruelty. For 10 long years, she kept the girl chained and hidden away. This story is intense and difficult, so pause for a moment, take a breath, and listen closely. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know which city and country you're tuning in from. Your support helps ensure these stories are remembered instead of erased. Now, let's begin. It was the spring of 1859 when a baby girl was born in a small cabin behind the Whitmore plantation in Warren County, Mississippi. Her eyes were the color of amber, and even by dim candlelight, her skin seemed to hold a glow. Her mother, Ruth, was a field slave, and as she looked at her newborn daughter, she felt something she had rarely known in her 32 years of bondage. Not the familiar fear of the master's temper or the overseer's whip, but a different kind of terror altogether. With the kind of instinct only a mother possesses, Ruth understood that her daughter's remarkable beauty would become either a salvation or a destruction. She named the child Seraphina, after the highest order of angels. Years earlier, she had heard the plantation mistress read the word aloud from a book of religious poetry. Though Ruth could neither read nor write, that word stayed with her. Seraphina, the burning ones, the angels closest to God. She whispered it into her daughter's ear that first night, praying that heaven might offer the protection she herself could not provide. The Whitmore plantation covered 1,800 acres of some of the richest cotton land in the Mississippi Delta. The main house sat on a gentle rise overlooking the fields, a 2-story Greek Revival mansion with white columns and wide verandas that seemed to mock the suffering that made such grandeur possible. By 1859, the plantation held 147 enslaved people and produced nearly 500 bales of cotton annually, placing the Whitmore family among the wealthiest in the region. The master of the house was Colonel James Whitmore, a 63-year-old man known for running what he called a tight operation. He rarely visited the slave quarters, leaving daily management to his overseers and his wife. Most of his time was spent in Vicksburg, tending to business and attending political meetings. He had served 2 terms in the Mississippi state legislature and considered himself a gentleman of the highest order. He owned human beings with the same casualness as he owned horses or furniture, never once questioning the morality of the system that had built his fortune. But the real power in the Whitmore household rested not with the colonel, but with his wife, Helena. At 41, she had once been considered the most beautiful debutante in Natchez society, but time and disappointment had hardened her features and poisoned her heart. She had given her husband 3 sons, all of whom survived to adulthood, and she considered this her greatest achievement. Still, Helena lived with a secret bitterness that colored everything she did. She knew her beauty was fading, she saw it each morning in the mirror, in the fine lines around her eyes and the slight loosening of her jaw, and she could not bear it. Helena ruled the domestic slaves with an iron hand. She personally supervised the house servants, the cooks, the seamstresses, and the nursemaids, letting nothing escape her attention. She prided herself on maintaining what she called proper order, meaning complete submission from every enslaved person working inside her home. The field slaves answered to the overseers, the house slaves answered to Helena. And Helena answered to no one. For the first 7 years of her life, Seraphina lived in relative obscurity. She stayed with her mother in the small cabin behind the main house where Ruth worked as a seamstress. The work was brutal. Ruth spent 14 hours a day washing, boiling, and pressing the Whitmore family's fine linens and clothing. Her hands were permanently scarred from the lye soap and scalding water. Yet she kept her daughter close, teaching her to stay quiet, stay invisible, and stay alive. Seraphina absorbed these lessons well, helping her mother carry water from the well and sort through the dirty laundry. She learned to fold sheets so perfectly that not a single wrinkle remained. She learned to walk softly, speak only when spoken to, and never look a white person directly in the eye. These were the rules of survival that every enslaved child absorbed, often before they could even understand their meaning. But there was one thing Ruth could not teach her daughter to hide. She could not dim the light that seemed to radiate from Seraphina's face. By the time the girl turned 7, her beauty had become impossible to overlook. Her amber eyes shifted with the light, changing from deep gold to honey brown. Her features were nearly unnaturally symmetrical, with high cheekbones and a delicate chin. Her flawless deep brown skin seemed to hold warmth even in the coldest weather. And when she smiled, which was rare, the effect was startling. The other enslaved people noticed first. They whispered among themselves, some in admiration, others in warning. Old Bessie, who worked in the kitchen and claimed to have the gift of sight, told Ruth to keep that child hidden. "That kind of pretty brings nothing but trouble," she said. "Either the men will want her or the women will hate her. Either way, it ends in blood." Ruth tried. She kept Seraphina in their cabin as much as possible, dressed her in the plainest, most shapeless clothes she could find, rubbed dirt on her face, and kept her hair wrapped tight under a rough cloth. But beauty like Seraphina's could not be concealed any more than the sun could be hidden behind a handkerchief. It shone through everything. The day that changed everything came in September of 1859. The summer heat had finally broken, and Helena Whitmore decided to walk through the domestic work areas to conduct one of her inspections. She did this periodically, appearing without warning to criticize the enslaved people's work and remind them of their place. On this particular afternoon, she passed the laundry area just as Seraphina emerged from the cabin carrying a basket of folded linens. The girl did not see the mistress approaching. She was focused on balancing the heavy basket, trying not to drop any of the carefully pressed sheets. The cloth had slipped from her head, and her hair, which Ruth had tried to keep hidden, fell in soft waves around her face. The afternoon sun caught her at the perfect angle, illuminating her features with a golden light. Helena Whitmore stopped walking. She stood perfectly still for several seconds, staring at the child with an expression that witnesses would later struggle to describe. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something deeper and more dangerous. It was the look of a woman confronting something she could not accept. Ruth saw the mistress and felt her blood turn to ice. She dropped the shirt she was wringing and rushed toward her daughter, but she was too late. Helena had already seen. And what Helena saw, she could never unsee. That night, Helena lay awake in her canopied bed, staring at the ceiling while her husband snored beside her. She could not stop thinking about the slave girl. She could not stop comparing. When she closed her eyes, she saw those amber irises and that perfect skin, and she felt a rage building inside her that frightened even herself. How dare this child, this piece of property, possess what Helena was losing? How dare she exist at all? By morning, Helena had made her decision. She told herself it was about discipline. She told herself it was about maintaining proper order. She told herself the girl had been insolent, had failed to show proper respect, had looked at her with defiance. None of these things were true. But Helena repeated them until she almost believed them herself. The truth, which she would never admit even in the privacy of her own mind, was much simpler. She could not bear to look at Seraphina, and if she could not destroy the girl's beauty, she would hide it where no one would ever see it again. The cellar beneath the Whitmore mansion had been used for storage since the house was built in 1841. It was a large space, nearly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with stone walls and a dirt floor. One section had been converted into a wine cellar where the colonel kept his collection of imported French wines. But the back portion remained unused, a dark and damp space that even the house servants rarely entered. This was where Helena decided to put the girl. She gave the orders to the overseer, a man named Thomas Crenshaw, who carried them out without question. He was paid well not to ask questions. That evening, after the colonel had retired to his study with a glass of brandy, 2 of the domestic slaves came to Ruth's cabin under Crenshaw's supervision. They took Seraphina while Ruth screamed and begged. They dragged her across the yard and into the main house through the back entrance. They carried her down the wooden stairs into the cellar, and they chained her to an iron ring bolted into the stone wall. Ruth tried to follow. She fought against the hands that held her back, scratching and biting like a wild animal. Crenshaw struck her across the face with the back of his hand, knocking her to the ground. "If you say one word about this," he told her, "I will sell you to the traders, and you will never see this place again. You will never know what happened to your girl. You understand me?" Ruth understood. She understood that she was powerless. She understood that her daughter had just been swallowed by the earth. And she understood that there was nothing she could do about it. The first night in the cellar, Seraphina did not understand what was happening. She cried for her mother until her voice gave out. She pulled at the chain around her ankle until the iron cut into her skin and blood ran down her foot. She called out for help, but her voice could not penetrate the thick stone walls and the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs. No one came. No one would come. The cellar was almost completely dark. A tiny window, no bigger than a man's hand, sat high on the wall near the ceiling. It let in a thin sliver of daylight during the afternoon hours, just enough to distinguish day from night. But for most of the time, Seraphina existed in total blackness. She could not see her own hands in front of her face. She could not see the walls that imprisoned her. She could only feel the cold stone beneath her body and the weight of the chain on her leg. Helena established a routine that would continue for the next 10 years. Twice a day, a kitchen slave would bring a bowl of food down to the cellar. In the morning, it was usually cold cornmeal mush. In the evening, it was whatever scraps remained from the family's dinner. The slave who brought the food was forbidden to speak to Seraphina, forbidden to bring a light, forbidden to tell anyone about the girl in the cellar. Helena made it clear that any violation of these rules would result in immediate sale to the slave traders who regularly passed through Vicksburg. For the first few months, Seraphina screamed whenever someone opened the cellar door. She begged them to release her. She promised to be good, to be invisible, to do whatever they wanted. But the slaves who brought her food could not help her even if they wanted to. They were as trapped as she was, imprisoned by a system that gave them no power and no choices. They left the food and they left, and Seraphina remained alone in the darkness. Time became meaningless in the cellar. Without the regular rhythm of day and night, without work to structure her hours, Seraphina lost track of how long she had been imprisoned. Days blended into weeks, weeks dissolved into months. She slept when she was tired. She ate when food appeared. She cried until she had no tears left. And then, slowly, something inside her began to change. The human mind is remarkably adaptable. Faced with conditions that should have driven her to madness, Seraphina's consciousness found ways to survive. She began to create structure out of nothingness. She counted her breaths in sets of 100. She recited every word she could remember her mother saying, playing conversations over and over in her memory until they became as real as any physical object. She traced patterns on the stone floor with her fingers, memorizing their shapes in the darkness. She invented games, stories, entire worlds that existed only in her imagination. But the most important adaptation Seraphina made was learning to listen. The cellar sat directly beneath the main floor of the Whitmore mansion. The stone walls muffled most sounds, but the wooden floorboards above her head allowed certain noises to penetrate. When she pressed her ear to the wall in just the right spot, she could hear voices from the rooms above. At first, the sounds were just meaningless vibrations. But over time, as her other senses sharpened in compensation for the darkness, she began to distinguish words, then sentences, then entire conversations. She heard everything that happened in the Whitmore household. She heard the colonel arguing with his business partners about debts and declining cotton prices. She heard Helena berating the house slaves for imagined failures. She heard the 3 Whitmore sons discussing their plans and their secrets when they thought no one was listening. She heard visitors arrive and depart. She heard whispered confessions and shouted accusations. The house above her held no secrets that she did not eventually discover, and she remembered everything. By her second year in the cellar, Seraphina had developed a mental catalogue of the Whitmore family's most closely guarded information. She knew that the colonel had borrowed heavily from a bank in New Orleans to cover gambling debts that he hid from his wife. She knew that the eldest son, William, had fathered a child with a free black woman in Vicksburg and was paying her to keep quiet. She knew that the middle son, Robert, had stolen silver from the family collection and sold it to fund his drinking habit. She knew that the youngest son, Thomas Jr., was terrified of his mother and often cried himself to sleep at night. She also knew things about Helena. She knew that the mistress had once pushed a house slave down the stairs, causing the woman to lose her unborn baby, and had convinced everyone it was an accident. She knew that Helena doctored the household accounts, skimming money into a private fund that she kept hidden from her husband. She knew that Helena had forged a letter to destroy her own sister's engagement 20 years earlier, a secret she had never told anyone. This knowledge became Seraphina's most precious possession. In the darkness, where she had nothing else, she had power. Not the power to escape, not yet. But the power of knowing, the power of waiting, the power of understanding her enemies better than they understood themselves. The years passed with agonizing slowness. Seraphina grew from a child into a young woman entirely within the confines of that cellar. Her body adapted to the limited space as best it could. The chain around her ankle left a permanent scar, a ring of thickened skin that would mark her for the rest of her life. Her muscles weakened from lack of movement. Her skin, once a healthy brown, grew ashen from never seeing sunlight. Her eyes, those remarkable amber eyes, developed the ability to see in almost total darkness, like a creature that had evolved for a life underground. But her mind grew stronger. Without external stimulation, she turned inward, developing a memory so precise that she could recall conversations she had overheard years earlier word for word. She taught herself to think in organized patterns, to analyze information, to make connections between disparate pieces of knowledge. She played mental chess against herself, developing strategies and counter-strategies that grew increasingly complex over time. She had no way of knowing it, but she was training herself to become something that the Whitmore family could never have imagined. She was becoming dangerous. Her mother, Ruth, tried to reach her. For the first 3 years of Seraphina's imprisonment, Ruth managed to bribe one of the kitchen slaves to pass messages through the food deliveries. These messages were simple, just a few whispered words that the slave would repeat before leaving the cellar. "Your mama loves you. Stay strong. I'm still here." These fragments of connection were the only thing that kept Seraphina from losing hope entirely. But in the winter of 1862, the messages stopped. Seraphina waited for weeks, then months, listening for any word from her mother. Finally, she heard the truth from a conversation between Helena and the housekeeper. Ruth had died. Pneumonia, they said. She had worked through a fever, too afraid of punishment to rest, and her lungs had filled with fluid. She was buried in the slave cemetery behind the cotton fields in an unmarked grave. Seraphina did not cry when she learned her mother was dead. She had exhausted her tears years earlier. Instead, she felt something new crystallizing inside her. It was cold and hard and patient, like a diamond forming under impossible pressure. It was hatred. Not the hot, explosive anger that burns itself out quickly. This was something else entirely. This was the kind of hatred that could wait, that could plan, that could endure anything for as long as it took to achieve its purpose. And now she knew exactly what that purpose would be. The war had already begun. Seraphina had listened to endless conversations about it through the floorboards above her head. In April of 1861, Confederate forces had fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and the South had erupted in celebration. The Whitmore household was caught up in the patriotic fervor. The colonel gave speeches about states' rights and Southern honor. The 3 sons argued about who would be first to enlist. Helena organized sewing circles to make uniforms for the local regiment. None of them understood what was coming. They believed their own propaganda, convinced that the war would be short and glorious, that the Yankees would be defeated within months. Seraphina, listening from her cellar prison, knew better. She had heard the colonel's private conversations with business associates who were less optimistic. She had heard the whispered concerns about British neutrality, about the Union naval blockade, about the difficulty of winning a war of attrition against a more industrialized enemy. By 1862, the reality of war was beginning to penetrate even the isolation of the Whitmore plantation. Cotton prices collapsed as the blockade prevented exports to European markets. The oldest son, William, came home from Tennessee with a bullet wound in his shoulder and stories of carnage that silenced the dinner table. Supplies grew scarce. The overseers were drafted into the Confederate Army, replaced by older men and boys who could not maintain the same level of control. The enslaved population grew restless, sensing that something was changing, that the world they had known was beginning to crack. And in her cellar prison, Seraphina waited. She had been in the darkness for 5 years now, and she had learned the most important lesson that the darkness could teach. She had learned that patience was power. She had learned that silence was strength. She had learned that the things people tried to bury had a way of rising up again. She was 12 years old. She had not seen sunlight since she was 7. She had not heard a kind word since her mother died. She had no reason to believe that her situation would ever change. But she knew with a certainty that went beyond logic or evidence that her time would come. The house above her was beginning to crumble. She could hear it in every worried conversation, every angry argument, every desperate prayer. The Whitmore family was running out of money, running out of allies, running out of time. The world that had created their wealth and power was collapsing, and they were too blind to see it. But Seraphina saw. In the darkness where they had thrown her, she saw everything, and she was ready. The spring of 1864 brought changes that Seraphina could track through the sounds above her head. The conversations grew more desperate. She heard Helena arguing with the colonel about selling off parcels of land to cover their debts. She heard William, now recovered from his wound but permanently weakened, discussing the possibility of defeat with his brothers. She heard the house servants moving with less caution, speaking more freely when they thought the family couldn't hear. The balance of power was shifting, and everyone could feel it. The food deliveries became less regular. Sometimes an entire day would pass without anyone bringing Seraphina anything to eat. She learned to stretch her meager rations, to ignore the constant gnaw of hunger that had become her permanent companion. Her body had adapted to near starvation, becoming thin and wiry, requiring less sustenance to survive. This was not strength, this was simple biological desperation. But it meant that when others might have died, she endured. In November of 1864, she heard through the floorboards about something called Sherman's March. A Union general named William Sherman was cutting a path of destruction through Georgia, burning everything in his wake as his army moved from Atlanta toward the sea. The terror in Helena's voice when she discussed this news with her husband was unmistakable. If Sherman turned north into Mississippi, if the Union Army reached Warren County, everything they had built would be destroyed. Seraphina listened to their fear, and for the first time in 7 years, she smiled. The winter of 1864–65 was the hardest the Whitmore plantation had ever experienced. The Confederate economy was in complete collapse. The paper money the family had accumulated was nearly worthless. Most of their slaves had run away, heading north toward the Union lines or simply disappearing into the chaos of a disintegrating society. The overseers had long since abandoned their posts. The fields lay fallow, the cotton rotting where it stood because there was no one left to pick it. Helena reduced the household staff to a skeleton crew of 3 enslaved people who had nowhere else to go. She dismissed the cook and took over the kitchen herself, something she had never done in her entire privileged life. The meals grew simpler. The wine cellar was emptied and sold. The silver was pawned piece by piece to pay for basic necessities. The great house, once a symbol of wealth and power, began to show signs of neglect. Paint peeled from the columns. Shutters hung at crooked angles. The gardens grew wild with weeds. Through all of this, Seraphina remained in her cellar prison. Helena seemed to have forgotten about her entirely, too consumed with the disaster unfolding above ground to think about the girl she had buried alive years earlier. The food deliveries became even more sporadic. Sometimes 3 or 4 days would pass without anyone opening the cellar door. Seraphina survived on rainwater that seeped through the tiny window and on rats that she caught with her bare hands in the darkness. She had become something less than human and more than human at the same time, stripped down to pure will and burning purpose. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war was over. The Confederacy was dead. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the Whitmore mansion, a young woman who had been imprisoned for nearly 6 years heard the news through the floorboards and knew that her moment was finally approaching. The weeks following the Confederate surrender brought chaos to Warren County, Mississippi. Union troops began moving through the region, enforcing the terms of defeat and spreading word of emancipation to enslaved people who had not yet heard. Plantation owners who had ruled like kings now faced the collapse of everything they had known. Some fled. Some took their own lives rather than accept the new reality. Others, like the Whitmore family, simply refused to believe that their world had truly ended. Helena Whitmore continued to run her household as if nothing had changed. She gave orders to the remaining servants with the same imperious tone she had always used. She spoke of the situation as temporary, a setback that would soon be corrected when proper order was restored. Her denial was so complete that it bordered on madness. The colonel, broken by the loss of everything he had worked for, retreated to his study and drank himself into a stupor every day. The three sons scattered. William went to Vicksburg to see what could be salvaged of the family's business interests. Robert disappeared entirely, running from gambling debts that had accumulated during the war. Thomas Jr., the youngest, remained at the plantation, too afraid to leave and too weak to be of any use. And in the cellar, Seraphina waited. She had waited for nearly 6 years. She could wait a little longer. The moment came on a warm evening in late May. Seraphina had been listening to the sounds above her head, tracking the movements of the remaining household members as she had done for years. She heard Helena retire to her bedroom. She heard the colonel's drunken snoring from his study. She heard Thomas Jr. pacing in his room as he did every night, too anxious to sleep. And then she heard something she had never heard before. She heard the cellar door open at an unusual hour. A figure descended the stairs carrying a candle. The light, dim as it was, seemed blindingly bright to Seraphina's darkness-adapted eyes. She shrank back against the wall, shielding her face with her hands. For a moment, she thought Helena had finally come to kill her, to eliminate the evidence of her crime before the Union authorities could discover it. But the voice that spoke was not Helena's. It belonged to an old woman named Bessie, the same kitchen slave who had warned Ruth about Seraphina's dangerous beauty all those years ago. Bessie was 73 years old now, one of the few enslaved people who had remained on the plantation because she was too old and weak to run. But she had never forgotten the girl in the cellar. And now, with the old order crumbling around them, she had decided to act. "Girl," Bessie whispered, her voice cracking with age and emotion. "The war is over. You are free. Do you understand me? You are free." Seraphina lowered her hand slowly, squinting against the candlelight. She had not seen another human face in nearly 6 years. She had almost forgotten what people looked like. Bessie's weathered features, illuminated by the flickering flame, seemed like something from a dream. Bessie had brought tools, a hammer, a chisel. She had stolen them from the tool shed days earlier, hiding them under her mattress until the right moment. Now she knelt beside Seraphina and began working on the iron ring that had held the chain in place for so long. The metal was rusted, weakened by years of moisture seeping through the cellar walls. It took nearly an hour of patient work, but finally the ring broke free from the stone. Seraphina stood for the first time in years. Her legs could barely support her weight. Her muscles had atrophied from disuse, leaving her as weak as a newborn. She leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, feeling the strange sensation of standing upright after so long spent crouching and lying on the cold floor. Bessie helped her up the stairs, one agonizing step at a time. The cellar door opened onto a hallway at the back of the house near the kitchen. The hallway was dark, but compared to the absolute blackness of the cellar, it seemed flooded with light. Seraphina blinked, tears streaming from her eyes as they struggled to adjust. "You need to go," Bessie said. "You need to get away from this place before they find you gone. There are Union soldiers in Vicksburg. They will help you." But Seraphina did not move toward the door. Instead, she turned and looked back into the house, toward the main rooms where the Whitmore family slept. Her face, gaunt and pale from years of darkness, showed no expression, but her amber eyes, still remarkable despite everything she had endured, burned with a light that made old Bessie take a step backward. "No," Seraphina said. Her voice was rusty from disuse, barely more than a whisper, but the word was clear. "I am not leaving. Not yet." Bessie tried to argue. She told Seraphina that staying was dangerous, that Helena would kill her if she found out she had escaped, that the only sensible thing to do was run and never look back. But Seraphina had not survived 6 years in that cellar by being sensible. She had survived by becoming something else entirely, something that did not run from its enemies, something that hunted them. She told Bessie to go back to her cabin and pretend nothing had happened. She told her to act normal in the morning, to go about her duties as usual. "Whatever happens," Seraphina said, "you did not see me. You do not know anything. Do you understand?" Bessie understood. She had lived her entire life under the rule of people who destroyed whatever they could not control. She recognized that same quality in Seraphina's eyes. Whatever the girl had become during those years in the darkness, she was not a victim anymore. She was something far more dangerous. That night, while the Whitmore family slept, Seraphina explored the house she had only known through sounds and vibrations. She moved silently through the hallways, her bare feet making no noise on the wooden floors. The layout was exactly as she had mapped it in her mind based on years of listening to footsteps and voices above her head. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew which doors squeaked on their hinges. She knew where everyone slept and at what hours they typically woke. She found Helena's private office on the second floor, a small room where the mistress kept her personal papers and correspondence. The door was locked, but the lock was old and poorly maintained. Seraphina worked at it with a hairpin she had found on a dresser, using skills she had never been taught but had somehow intuited during her years of isolation. The lock clicked open within minutes. The office was exactly as she had imagined it, a small writing desk near the window, a cabinet against the wall, stacks of papers and ledgers organized with Helena's characteristic precision. Seraphina moved through the room methodically, examining each document by the thin light of the moon coming through the window. Her eyes, still more comfortable in darkness than in light, had no difficulty making out the words. She found everything she was looking for and more. She found the doctored household accounts that proved Helena had been stealing from her husband for years. She found letters that documented the cover-up of the slave woman's death on the stairs. She found correspondence with lawyers in New Orleans that revealed the full extent of the Whitmore family's debts, far worse than even the colonel knew. And she found something she had not expected. A letter from a doctor in Natchez dated 1858 confirming that Helena was barren and that the 3 sons she claimed to have borne were actually purchased from a slave trader who dealt in light-skinned children who could pass for white. This last discovery was staggering. The Whitmore sons were not Whitmores at all. They were the children of enslaved women, bought as infants and raised as white aristocrats. Helena had maintained this deception for over 30 years, terrified that the truth would destroy her social standing and her marriage. It was the most closely guarded secret of her life. And now it belonged to Seraphina. She took the most important documents and hid them in a location outside the house that she had identified during her exploration. Then she returned to the cellar, closing the door behind her. When dawn came, she was back in her familiar darkness, the chain arranged around her ankle to look as if it was still attached. No one would know she had ever left. For the next 2 weeks, Seraphina continued her nocturnal explorations. She grew stronger each day, forcing herself to exercise in the darkness, rebuilding muscles that had wasted away during her imprisonment. She ate better now, taking food from the kitchen during her nighttime wanderings. The color began to return to her skin. Her movements became more fluid, more controlled. She was preparing herself for what was to come. During the days, she listened. She learned that William had returned from Vicksburg with terrible news. The family's remaining assets had been seized by Union authorities. The bank in New Orleans was demanding immediate repayment of the colonel's gambling debts, threatening legal action if the money was not produced. Creditors were circling like vultures, sensing the weakness of a family that had once seemed invincible. Helena's response to this crisis was to double down on her denial. She insisted that they could rebuild, that the old ways would return, that they simply needed to hold on until proper order was restored. But her voice had taken on a desperate, brittle quality that Seraphina recognized. The mistress was losing control. The carefully constructed world she had built was falling apart around her, and she had no idea that the final blow was about to come from beneath her own feet. Seraphina chose her moment carefully. On a Sunday morning in mid-June, while the family was at breakfast, she emerged from the cellar for the last time. She had washed herself in the kitchen basin and dressed in clothes she had taken from a storage trunk. They were old and slightly too large, but they were clean. She had brushed her hair and pinned it up in a simple style. For the first time in nearly 6 years, she looked almost human. She walked into the dining room without making a sound. The family was seated around the long mahogany table, picking at a meager breakfast of cornbread and weak coffee. Helena sat at one end, the Colonel at the other. Thomas Jr. sat between them, his eyes fixed on his plate. None of them noticed her at first. Then Helena looked up and screamed. The sound that came from the mistress's throat was barely human. It was the scream of someone seeing a ghost, seeing the dead rise from the grave, seeing their worst nightmare made flesh. She knocked over her chair as she stumbled backward, pressing herself against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. The Colonel stared at Seraphina in confusion, not understanding what he was seeing. He had never known about the girl in the cellar. Helena had kept that secret from him as carefully as she had kept all her others. To him, this was simply a strange young black woman who had somehow entered his home. His first instinct was to call for help, to summon someone to remove this intruder. But there was no one left to call. "Good morning," Seraphina said. Her voice was calm and clear, stronger now than it had been when she first emerged from the darkness. "I believe we have some matters to discuss." Helena found her voice. "Get out," she hissed. "Get out of my house. I will have you whipped. I will have you killed. I will." "You will do nothing," Seraphina interrupted. Her tone was almost gentle, but there was steel beneath the softness. "You will sit down and listen, because I have things to tell your husband that he needs to hear." The Colonel looked between Seraphina and his wife, seeing the terror on Helena's face and not understanding its source. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Helena, who is this woman?" "That," Seraphina said, "is an excellent question. Why don't you tell him, Mrs. Whitmore? Tell him where I have been for the past 6 years. Tell him what you did to a 7-year-old child because you could not bear to look at her face." And she told him. She told him everything. She told him about the cellar, about the chain, about the years of darkness and isolation. She told him about the near starvation, the rats, the complete absence of human contact. She described it all in simple, precise language without emotion, as if she were giving testimony in a court of law. The Colonel listened in growing horror. Whatever his faults, whatever his complicity in the system of slavery, he had never sanctioned anything like this. He had believed himself to be a gentleman, a man of honor. The idea that his wife had imprisoned a child in their cellar for years, had tortured her with isolation and neglect, was almost more than he could comprehend. Helena tried to deny it. She called Seraphina a liar, a runaway, a thief who had broken into their home. But her denials were weak, contradicted by the obvious terror she had shown when Seraphina first appeared. And when Seraphina produced a handful of documents from inside her dress, Helena's face went white. "These are from your private office," Seraphina said. "The household accounts you have been doctoring for years. The letters about the woman who fell down the stairs. And this one is particularly interesting." She held up the letter from the doctor in Natchez. Helena lunged toward her, trying to snatch the paper from her hand, but Seraphina was faster. She stepped aside easily, and Helena crashed into the dining table, sending dishes crashing to the floor. "Your sons," Seraphina said, addressing the Colonel directly. "They are not your sons. They are not your wife's sons. They were purchased from a slave trader in 1829, 1831, and 1834. Light-skinned children who could pass for white. Your wife has been lying to you for over 30 years. The Colonel stared at the letter in Seraphina's hand. His face had gone gray. He looked at Helena, who was sobbing now, collapsed against the table, her carefully constructed world finally crumbling around her. Thomas Jr. sat frozen in his chair, unable to process what he was hearing. Everything he had believed about himself, about his family, about his place in the world was being destroyed in the space of a few minutes. He was not a Whitmore. He was not white. He was the son of a slave, purchased like property, raised in a lie. The destruction of the Whitmore family happened quickly after that morning. The Colonel, confronted with the enormity of his wife's deception, suffered a stroke within hours. He survived, but he was paralyzed on his left side and could no longer speak clearly. He spent his remaining years in a wheelchair, cared for by servants who were now free and had to be paid wages the family could no longer afford. Helena was arrested 2 days later. Seraphina had sent copies of the most incriminating documents to the Union military commander in Vicksburg, along with a detailed account of her imprisonment. The occupation authorities were looking for ways to demonstrate their commitment to justice in the defeated South. Helena Whitmore, a wealthy white woman who had imprisoned a child in a cellar for 6 years, was a perfect example.